Down deeper, we would see that what often triggers our anger or frustration has deeper roots. It could be something in our childhood or some particular set of circumstances that triggers the emotion. We can exploit the vast literature in psychology amassed over the last 100 years, including detailed studies of childhood and the impact of our early development. Melanie Klein, John Bowlby, Donald Spartan ally, and when the Melians surrendered, the Athenians voted to kill all of their men and sell the women and children into slavery. Nothing remotely like this had ever happened under Pericles. Emotions also means that it is very hard for us to learn from them, to stop or prevent compulsive behavior. Children who felt abandoned by their parents will tend to create patterns of abandonment in later life, without seeing the reason, effects and seeing what truly matters. For instance, in a divorce proceeding with child custody issues, rational people will manage to let go of their bitterness and prejudice and reason what is in the best overall long-term interests of the child. Irrational people will become consumed with a power struggle against the spouse, will let resentments and desires for vengeance secretly guide their decisions. This will lead to a protracted battle and a damaged child. In early childhood we were at our most sensitive and vulnerable. Our relationship to our parents had a much greater impact on us. Take, for example, a young man who had a distant, narcissistic mother. As an infant or child, he experienced her coldness as abandonment, and to be abandoned must mean he was somehow. The way to recognize this in yourself and in others is by noticing behavior that is suddenly childish in its intensity and seemingly out of character. This could center on any key emotion. It could be fear of losing control, of failure. In this case, we react by withdrawing from the situation and the presence of others, like a child curling up into a ball. A sudden illness, brought on by the intense fear, will conveniently paradise. It could be extreme mistrust, originating from an authority figure in early childhood who disappointed or betrayed us, generally the father. This often triggers a sudden rebellious attitude. In the midst of such an attack, we must struggle to detach ourselves and contemplate the possible source, the wound in early childhood, and the patterns it has locked us into. This deep understanding of whoever lived as the model for this. His family was large and poor, and his father, an alcoholic, mercilessly beat all of the children, including young Chekhov. Chekhov became a doctor and took up from curiosity itself. You want to retain the elasticity of spirit you had as a child, interested in everything, while retaining the hard-nosed need to verify and scrutinize for yourself all ideas and beliefs. The two inherit in the form of inclinations, aversions. The inspiration born of a feeling is the grandchild of a judgment and often of a false judgment, and in any event not a child of your own. To trust one's feelings means to give more obedience to. Facing this dilemma from early childhood on, most of us come up with a solution that works quite well. We create a self, an image of their mothers, or fathers, might be deep narcissists themselves. Too self-absorbed to acknowledge the child, to encourage its early efforts at independence. Or alternatively the parents could be enmeshers over-involved in the child's life, suffocating it with attention, isolating it from others, and living through its advancement as a means to validate their own self-worth. They give the child no room to establish a self. In the backgrounds of almost all deep in childhood, if such narcissists are extroverts, they can function reasonably well, and even thrive. They become masters at attracting notice and monopolizing attention. They can appear vivacious and exciting. In a child, such qualities can seem a sign of future social success. But underneath the surface, they are becoming dangerously deep and intimate relationship in which they exposed any vulnerability. Look for signs of a troubled childhood. Stalin himself had a father who beat him mercilessly in a rather cold and unloving, including his ongoing infatuation with a nearby peasant woman with whom he had had a child. He also wrote about the brothels he frequented, the gonorrhea he had caught, and his endless gambling. Eventually settled into a relatively comfortable rhythm. She had become his most trusted assistant. Besides bearing 8 children in 12 years, 5 of whom survived, she carefully copied out his books. He was asking them to give up their style of living, their comforts, and the children's future inheritance. Sonia did not feel the need for any drastic change in their lifestyle, and she resented his accusations that her part would make him regret this. She constantly tried to pit the children against him. She had to read everything he wrote in his diaries, and if he hid them, she would somehow find them and read. Many children. She had never been deeply spiritual. Their connection had always been more physical. Why should he expect her to suddenly, unhappy with himself, someone who had never felt loved enough since early childhood and who was undergoing a very real personal crisis? She could have offered her love and support for his new life while or generosity tends to diverge from your way of thinking. These value systems are largely formed in early childhood and are not consciously created by people. Keeping in mind their value system will allow you to largely on words. They would get patients to talk, particularly going over their early childhood. In this way they hope to gain access to their patient's unconscious. Erikson instead focused mostly on completely goes his own way in his ideas and style, who acts the same. Whether he's talking to his boss or to a child, and you have imagined a person who would be shunned, ridiculed, and despised. Observational skills. When we were children, we were almost all great observers of people. Because we were small and weak, our survival depended on decoding. Individual was threatening from something in his or her body. Language. This is why children are the bane of inveterate liars, con artists, magicians, and people who pretend to be something they are not. Children quickly see through their front. Slowly, from the age of 5 onward, this sensitivity is lost as we start to turn inward and years. This means slowly reversing the process of self-absorption and regaining that outward directed view and curiosity you had as a child. Calmly in the eye. She put herself in the one-up position in relation to Putin by not making anything of his ploy. He seemed rather childish and petty in comparison. Her style does not include all of the alpha. Consequently could not have other children, so she completely doted on her son. Continually anxious that he might catch some illness, she very early on. His mother had an anxious nature, and after learning she could have no more children, she directed a great deal of her anxiety toward her only son. She smothered him with constant. Even at the age of 19, over his fate, anything less would stir up the old anxieties from childhood. And with the money he inherited, he had the power to realize his dream of total independence. His love of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, who studied infants, believed that the greedy and grasping type of child came into the world predisposed toward this character trait. There might be other genetic factors as well. John Bowlby, an anthropologist and psychoanalyst, studied patterns of attachment between mothers and children and came up with 4 basic schemas: free/autonomous, dismissing, enmeshed, ambivalent, and disorganized. The free/autonomous stamp comes From mothers who give their children freedom to discover themselves, and are continually sensitive to their needs but also protect them. Dismissing mothers are often distant, even sometimes hostile and rejecting. Such children are stamped with a feeling of abandonment, and the idea that they must continually fend for themselves. Because of their own problems or anxieties, they can make their children feel as if they have to take care of the person who should be taking care of them. Disorganized mothers send highly conflicting signals to their children, reflecting their own inner chaos and perhaps early emotional traumas. Nothing their children do is right, and such children can develop powerful emotional problems, particularly the way we use relationships to handle or modulate our stress. For instance, children of the dismissing parent will tend to avoid any kind of negative emotional situation and to wall themselves off from feelings of dependency. They might find it harder to commit to a relationship or will unconsciously push people away. The children of the enmeshed variety will experience a great deal of anxiety in. There is a fourth layer as well. It often is developed in late childhood and adolescence as people become aware of their character flaws. They do what they can to cover them up. If they sense that deep in their childhood a parent or father figure probably disappointed them, they came to mistrust and hate all those in power. In the end, over things for days, long after you have forgotten some innocuous comment that they have taken personally. As children, they had a gnawing feeling that they never got enough from their parents' love. Are animated and they can be quite witty. They are fun to be around, until the drama turns ugly. As children, they learned that the only way to get love and attention that lasted was to enmesh their parents in. How or why? Somehow they express the need to be taken care of, and they are masters at getting others to pamper them. In childhood, their parents indulged them in their slightest whim and protected them from any kind of harsh intrusion from the outside world. There are also some children who incite this behavior in their parents by acting especially helpless. Whatever the cause, as adults their greatest desire, just as when they were children, behind the smiles and flattery is a great deal of resentment at the role they have to play. They secretly, in childhood, these types often had to become the caregivers of their own mother, father, or siblings. The mother, for instance, made her own needs the primary concern of the family. Such children compensate for the lack of care that they receive with the feeling of employees so well, they are condescending to their spouse. They may have a secret life or vice you catch glimpses of. As children, they were often made to feel guilty for their own strong impulses and desires for family. Shortly after her birth, she grew up in poverty. Her mother actively disliked Joan and constantly beat her. As a child she learned that the stepfather she adored was not really her father, and shortly thereafter he too abandoned the family. Her childhood was an endless series of punishments, betrayals, and abandonments, which scarred perspective to think of the audience first and to strategize how to play on their imagination. The objects she had desired since childhood were all somewhat vague, elusive, and taboo. That was their allure. Herself and what she made with an aura of mystery. She never talked about her impoverished childhood. She made up countless contradictory stories about her past. Nobody really knew anything. One of the most striking examples of this syndrome is the view we take of our childhood as it recedes into the past. Most of us remember a golden time of play and excitement. As we get older, it becomes even more golden in our memory. Of course, we conveniently forget the anxieties, insecurities, and hurts that plagued us in childhood and more than likely consumed more of our mental space than the fleeting becomes, the greater the pleasure we derive from it. When we were children, if we were given a game with explicit instructions and rules, we quickly lost interest. But if the game was something we invented, or to take away this loved object, to triumph over the other person, a dynamic that most certainly has roots in their childhood. If other people are making money through some new gimmick, they want not wish, then deep analysis. In relation to the past, we may have a few fond or painful memories from childhood and later years, but in general the past baffles us. We change so much with each passing year, have mapped out a path to reach them. In relation to the past, you feel a deep sense of connection to your childhood. Yes, you are constantly changing, but these changes are on the surface and create the illusion. Would listen with a focus that was striking and charming, almost like a child. His large brown eyes would stay fixed on the senator in question, and with his chin resting on his hand, he would occasionally. From early on in life, we humans develop a defensive and self-protective side to our personality. It begins in early childhood as we cultivate a sense of personal physical space that others should not. One area, I am a rebel and you are less so. Many of these types of self-opinions are related to developmental issues in early childhood. For instance, the rebel type had a father figure who disappointed him. Conversation in that direction. People will become chatty without realizing it. Almost everyone likes to talk about their childhood, their family, the ins and outs of their work, or some cause that is dear to. As children, our minds were remarkably flexible. We could learn at a rate that far surpasses our adult capacities. We can attribute much of mind. In essence, Socrates assumed the weaker, vulnerable position of the ignorant child, always asking questions. The ultimate freedom. As a child, Anton Chekhov, 1860–1904, the future celebrated writer, faced each morning with a feeling of dread. Would he be beaten? That beat him out of any apparent malice or anger. He told Anton he was doing it out of love. It was God's will that children be beaten, to instill humility. That was how he had been raised, and look at what a fine, their ramshackle wooden house, and he would tremble with fear. More often than not, he was coming to the house at that hour to ask the child Anton to replace him in the grocery shop that he owned. There was no respite from the father's presence. On Sunday, one day the shop was closed, he would wake the children up at 4 or 5 in the morning to rehearse their singing for the church choir. There was mud everywhere, with giant potholes that could swallow a child up to the neck. There were no street lights. Prisoners would be tasked with finding the stray dogs on the streets and beating them too. Sometimes his humor turned aggressive. He played cruel practical jokes on other children in the neighborhood. Sent to the market by his mother, he often tormented the live duck or chicken that he carried. A penny to her name, the mother was forced to leave for Moscow with the other children. Only Anton would stay to finish his studies and get his diploma. He was charged with selling all of the remaining family. An artistic temperament, could have been a talented painter or musician. He felt bitter at his fate, a grocery store and 6 children. His father had beaten him, and so he beat his children. Although no longer a serf, Pavel still bowed and kissed the hand of every local mother, and not blame her for being so weak. With his mind emptied of rancor and obsessive thoughts of his lost childhood, it was as if a great weight had been suddenly lifted off him. His father drank even more and held some odd jobs that were quite a step down from owning a business. He continued to beat his children. No support system, living in the corner of a small room. Bitter thoughts about his fate and about the childhood he had never had. Gnawed at him in his few free moments. But as the weeks went by, what we all face in life. We carry with us traumas and hurts from early childhood. In our social life, as we get older, we accumulate disappointments and slights. We too are often haunted by a sense of toward hostility, greed, empathy, or kindness. We can notice these differences, for instance, in the case of the Chekhov children, who all had to respond to the same physical punishments of the father. At a children lacked this ability to distance themselves and were more easily enmeshed in the father's brutality. This would seem to indicate something different in the way Anton's brain was wired. Some children are greedier than others. They display from early on a greater need for attention. They tend to always see what is missing, what they possibility of unexpected events. This negative, narrowing attitude often has its origins in early childhood. Some children have little comfort or support in facing a frightening world. They develop the hostile attitude. Some children exhibit a hostile attitude at a very early age. They interpret weaning and the natural separation from parents as hostile actions. Other children must deal with a parent who likes to punish and inflict hurt. In both cases, the child looks out on a world that seems fraught with hostility, and their answer is to through the lens of their insecurities, generally related to doubts about their competence and intelligence. Perhaps as children they were made to feel guilty and uncomfortable with any efforts to excel, and the depressive attitude. As children, these types did not feel loved or respected by their parents. For helpless children, it is too much to imagine that their parents could be wrong or flawed in the resentful attitude. As children, these types never felt they got enough parental love and affection. They were always greedy for. The Roman Emperor Tiberius, 42 BC AD 37, is perhaps the most classic example of this type. As a child, his tutor noticed something wrong with the boy. He is a pitcher molded with blood and bile, they play with. If you hold on to them for too long, they become something dead. You are returning to your childlike spirit and curiosity, from before you had an ego and being right was more important than. Your goal must be to always move in the opposite direction. You rediscover the curiosity you once had as a child. Everything and everyone is a source of fascination to you. You keep learning him for his own purposes. And according to Kissinger, the key to Nixon and his split personality must somehow lie in his childhood. Can you imagine, Kissinger once observed, what this man would fussing after him, and he was quite manipulative if he did not get these things. His parents did not like this aspect of their child. Growing up in the pioneer days of Southern California, they preferred to have a stoic, self-reliant child. Nixon's father could be physically abusive and cold. His mother was more caring but frequently depressed and very debate. According to Kissinger, there was nothing he feared more than to be thought weak. But the weak and vulnerable child within does not miraculously disappear. If its needs have never been met or indeed dealing with two Nixons. To Kissinger, it was like seeing the unloved child come back to life. Had emerged. It was as if he secretly desired his own punishment, the child and the dark side taking revenge for being so deeply denied. Weaknesses. Like him, you have repressed the less socially acceptable traits you naturally possessed as a child. You have become terribly nice and pleasant. And like him, you have a dark side, one that you are. Face, their voice and body language is altered almost as if another person is confronting us, the features of the upset child suddenly becoming visible. We feel their shadow as it stirs and emerges. Gamut of emotions. We were not the innocent angels people imagine. Children to be willful and selfish. They felt that other people were judging them by the behavior of their children, so they wanted us to be nice, to put on a show for others, to act like the sweet angel. They urged us to be prize. We end up missing the intensity that we experienced in childhood, the full gamut of emotions, and even the creativity that came with this wilder energy. We secretly yearn to recapture it in some. Become unusually sensitive and touchy. Some of their deepest fears and insecurities from childhood have somehow become activated, and this makes them hyper-alert to any possible slight and ripe for smaller, repressed early on assertive and spontaneous impulses so natural to the child. Unconsciously we wish to have back such qualities, but we cannot overcome our internal taboos. We look out for those who are to have others take care of them, to regress to the dependency of childhood. They can never admit this to themselves or show any signs of such weakness, but unconsciously they are drawn to creating mistakes they have made. They have a playful, sometimes impish edge to them, as if they have retained more of the child within. They can play their role in life with a little bit of distance. See the last section of types, and unconsciously repulsed by their opposite. The reason for this is simple: we all secretly mourn for the child part of our character. We have lost the wildness, the spontaneity, the intensity of possibility that of being an adult who has managed to integrate the child and the adult, the dark and the light, the unconscious and the conscious mind. We yearn to be around them. Perhaps some of their take this process deeper by re-examining the earlier version of yourself. Look at traits in childhood that were drummed out of you by your parents and peers, certain weaknesses or vulnerabilities or forms. As children, our minds were much more fluid and open. We would make the most surprising and creative associations between ideas. But shadow and show it proudly. Fifth, feel free to play the impudent, willful child who mocks the stupidity and hypocrisy of others. Her 2 young children had both died from fevers while in Italy. Mary had been particularly close to her son William, and his death had pushed her into a profound depression. She had recently given birth to another child, a boy named Percy, but she felt continually anxious about his health. The guilt and gloom she felt surrounding the death of her children had finally caused some friction between her and her husband. They had been so close, had experienced so much together. Philosopher who advocated many radical ideas, including the end of private property. Famous writers would come to see the child Mary, for she was an object of fascination, with striking red hair like her. Suicide, which Mary would forever feel guilty about, even later, imagining that the children she had had with Shelley were somehow cursed. Shortly after the death of Harriet, Mary and Percy got married. More than to arrange flowers, play the pedal harp, sing songs from India, where she had lived as a child, and pose rather prettily. Could she be that superficial? Every now and then Mary would catch Jane Switzerland and had come to Italy for adventure and the good weather. Jane was now expecting her second child with Edward, just as Mary was now pregnant again. It seemed, in a fateful way, that then Jane had her second child. Now the 2 women could bond as young mothers. Finally someone to talk to about the difficulties of lazy. But worse than everything, Mary had terrible forebodings about the place. She feared greatly for the fate of her child Percy, only 3 years old. She smelled disaster in the walls of the isolated villa that She decided she would return to London and somehow find a way to support her 2 children. Mary empathized with her plight. She gave her a list of important contacts in England, including Shelley's best would move close to where Jane was living, in a more remote part of London. There Percy would be reunited with Jane's children. They could live for each other and share their memories, recapture the past. Night, at Jane's house. She and Percy had stuck around, Percy to play some games with Jane's children and Mary to talk some more. Hogg had arrived and Jane finally exploded at Mary, with a look Mary had. Widow, her need for a husband. Jane was now pregnant with Hogg's child. Mary struggled to get over her resentment and to help Jane as best she could. They saw less and less of each other. Young woman named Isabel Robinson who needed help. She had given birth to an illegitimate child and her father would certainly disown her if he discovered the truth. For weeks Mary conspired to vehemence with which she wanted Mary to stay away from London and give up her child, which meant giving up their inheritance. All these years she had been not a friend but a competitor, and now it. Of course, in turning Mary into someone so unlikable, Jane had to willfully ignore the context, the recent loss of 2 beloved children to illness, Shelley's own coldness toward his wife, and his pursuit of other eyes momentarily boring into you, with a look that suggests disdain and a touch of hostility. It is the look of a child who feels cheated. With this look the corners of the mouth will often be turned down, the nose are seen as rivals. Klein, who specialized in the study of infancy and early childhood, noticed that some children feel greater degrees of hostility and resentment toward the father and siblings for the. Certainly there are parents who create or intensify such envy by playing favorites, by withdrawing on purpose to make the child more dependent. In any event, infants or children experiencing such envy will not feel grateful and loved for the attention they do get, but instead, entire lives they are children and later adults for whom nothing is ever quite good enough. All potentially positive experiences are spoiled. Most of us experience moments in childhood in which we feel another person is getting more of the attention that we deserve, but we cost, and as they talk about such things, you will notice something childish in their demeanor, as if they were reliving a family drama in which they felt cheated by a sibling who had something better. Don't. Finally, you might imagine that envy is a somewhat rare occurrence in the modern world. After all, it is a primitive, childish emotion, and we live in such sophisticated times. Furthermore, not many people they present. We see only the most exciting images from their vacations, the happy faces of their friends and children, accounts of their continual self-improvement, the fascinating people they are. Kennedy, and you will see that his wealth brought him endless nightmares, including the most spoiled and unloving of children. Felt audiences would grow to like him. He could be comforting to children, like Walt himself. In fact, he began to feel the two of them were somehow magically connected, as if he were more than just they. We had a deep need to assert ourselves, to show we were not so helpless, and to fantasize about powers we did not possess. Children will often imagine the ability to see through walls, to fly, or to read. Some children do not go through that second phase in early childhood in which they must confront their relative smallness, and these children are more vulnerable to deeper forms of grandiosity later in life. They are the pampered, spoiled ones. The mother and the father continue to make such children feel like they are the center of the universe, shielding them from the pain of confronting the reality. Instill the slightest amount of discipline, the parents are met with a tantrum. Furthermore, such children come to disdain any form of authority compared with themselves and what they can get, the father. First, we find more people who experienced pampering attention in their childhood than ever in the past. Feeling like they were once the center of the universe becomes a hard thing to shake. They come to that they were somehow destined for greatness. They tell stories of their childhood and youth that indicate their uniqueness, as if fate had singled them out. They highlight events that showed from early on. Identified with her father experiencing his traumas and triumphs as if they were her own. As were all the Sforza children, girls included. Katerina was taught sword fighting and underwent rigorous physical. It was August and the sweltering heat made Katerina 7 months pregnant with her fourth child feel faint and continually nauseated. But as she contemplated the impending doom, the thought Countess, dining with her family in a nearby room, heard the shouts, and quickly shuffled her 6 children into a safer room in the palace's tower. She bolted the door and from a window, under which several of castle. Within minutes the assassins had broken into her room, taking her and her children captive. The enraged assassins had had enough. The next day they returned to the castle with her 6 children and called Katerina to the ramparts. With daggers and spears pointed at them in the most menacing fashion, and with the children wailing and begging for mercy, they ordered Katerina to surrender the fortress or they would kill them all. Blood. She might be fearless and the daughter of a Sforza, but no mother could possibly watch her children die before her eyes. Katerina wasted no time. She shouted down, "Do it then, you fools! I am already pregnant with another child by Count Ryorio and I have the means to make more," at which she lifted her skirts, as if to emphasize her. Katerina had foreseen the maneuver with the children and had calculated that the assassins were weak and indecisive. They should them if they ever did such a deed. And if she surrendered now, she and her children would all be imprisoned, and some poison would find its way into their food. She didn't care what they thought of her as everything she valued, and she would not disappoint him. She was the most like him of all his children. As he would have done, she had thought ahead. Her plan was to play for time until her remaining allies her own life. She was willing to suffer the worst conditions in prison to safeguard the inheritance for her children, a rare act of self-sacrifice for a person of power. But at the same time she was a shrewd and as adults we feel relatively mature and practical, but in love we can suddenly regress to behavior that can only be seen as childish. We experience fears and insecurities that are greatly exaggerated. We feel aggression, boldness, intellectual rigor, and physical prowess. Each child may also naturally possess these opposite gender traits in him or herself. In addition, each parent will also have a shadow side that the child must assimilate or deal with. For instance, a mother may be narcissistic rather than empathetic, and a father may be domineering. Children must adapt to this. In any event, the boy and the girl will internalize the positive and the negative qualities of the parent of the ambivalent, powerful emotions are triggered, and feeling ourselves transported to the primal relationship in our childhood, we act in ways that are often contrary to the persona we present. We become. Men of this type often had strong mother figures in their childhood. They became good, obedient boys, excellent students at school. Let us look at this phenomenon from a different angle as a crisis of identity. As children, we had a rather fluid sense of self. We absorbed the energy of everyone and everything around us. We felt Atlanta, Georgia, Martin Luther King Jr., 1929–1968, had a pleasant and carefree childhood. His father, Martin Sr., was the pastor of the large and thriving Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, so the King's children home life was stable and comfortable and included Grandmother King, who doted on young Martin Jr. He had a wide circle of friends. The few encounters he had with racism outside the neighborhood marred this idyllic childhood but left him relatively unscathed. Martin Jr., however, was exceptionally sensitive to his father was a strict disciplinarian who set solid boundaries of behavior for the three King children. When Martin Jr. misbehaved in any way, his father whipped him, telling the boy this was the only way. Was offered the position of president of the chapter, he turned it down. Coretta had just given birth to their first child, and his responsibilities as a father and as a minister were great enough. He would remain very moments he yearned for the simpler, easier days of the past, his happy childhood, his pleasant years at the university, the first year and a half at Dexter. Perhaps he should retire from the leadership role and the attack dogs, and the nightsticks, striking teenagers and even children. Soon television screens around America were broadcasting the tense, dramatic, and bloody scenes that ensued. Enormous crowds. Lessons in honing tactics. For some, this did not square with his position as a spiritual leader, for instance, his decision to use children and teenagers in Birmingham as a means to fill the city jails. Ministers connecting to this system does not come easily. Normally the signs of our uniqueness are clearer to us in early childhood. We found ourselves naturally drawn to particular subjects or activities, despite in his small town, the whole atmosphere of make-believe thrilled him. For Steve Jobs, it was passing an electronics store as a child and seeing the wondrous gadgets in the window, marveling at their design and his excitement and desire to imitate him. For the writer Jean-Paul Sartre, it was a childhood fascination with printed words on a page, and the possible magical meanings each word possessed. And, what we want is to fuse the curiosity and excitement we had toward the world as children, when almost everything seemed enchanting, with our adult intelligence status with our chimpanzee relatives. Depending on patterns from early childhood, in the group setting we become more passive or more aggressive than usual, revealing the less developed sides of our. This dynamic is similar to what we all experienced in childhood. We idealized our parents in order to feel more secure about the power they incompetent. Dealing with authority figures in the court tends to regress us to our childhood and the family dynamic. The way we adapted to our parents' power in the presence of our siblings will. And so we can say that courtiers tend to fall into certain types, depending on deep patterns stemming from childhood. Some of these types can become quite dangerous if they accumulate power within they careful to conceal. They feel they could do the job better, and they yearn to prove this. Perhaps they had competitive issues in childhood with the father figure, of resentment and envy for what others seem to have that they don't. Part of their childhood pattern. Their game is to infect the group with doubts and anxieties, stirring up trouble, which puts them at the. These types often are closer to their own shadow, aware of their own darkest yearnings. In childhood they probably felt these desires deeply but had to repress them, which made such desires all the more. Much as in any children's playground, in the court there is almost always a person who plays the role of the punching bag, whom stepmother to stepmother, and her presence within the court had been minimal. The English people knew that her childhood had been difficult and that Queen Mary had detested her, even throwing. This ambivalence began in our childhood and set the pattern for the rest of our lives. If our parents were relatively attentive and loving, we Remember our childhood fondly, as a golden period. What we conveniently forget is that even with such parents we tended to feel. Can remember only their coldness and our present antipathy. But we forget that in our childhood we tended to gloss over their negative. And so as children, when one emotion dominated us, the other lay underneath, a continual ambivalent undertone. As adults, we longer want to see themselves as authority figures whose role is to inculcate children with particular values and culture. Instead, parents like to see themselves more as equals, with a bit more knowledge and experience, whose role is really to validate their children's feelings and make sure they are continually entertained and occupied. They are behavior. This is the pose of parents, who demonstrate their love while indicating limits and boundaries. The child is trapped between affection and a touch of fear, and from that tension comes respect. Naturally, and that you are entitled to have all of these powers. That is the view of spoiled children, and you must see any signs of such an attitude within you as shameful. This world needs constant. He said or did seem to stop him. For someone so quiet and unassuming, Rockefeller could be annoyingly relentless, like a child. A few months after Clark had berated him, Rockefeller hit him with a rather unpleasant pattern for the family. He would leave his wife, Eliza, and 4 children, John being the eldest, for months on end in their flimsy cabin in western New York and travel the region plying his to the family's finances. And as he advanced in his career, he could not escape the anxieties that had plagued him in his childhood. He had a desperate need to make everything orderly and predictable in his. Unconsciously he was drawn to it for those very reasons. He could relieve his worst fears from childhood and surmount them by establishing rigorous control over the oil industry. It would be like need for control covers up vast layers of anxieties and insecurities. You must see the frightened child within, terrified by anything unpredictable. In this way you can cut them down to size, diminishing. Like. In addition, we all have certain insecurities that stem from wounds in our childhood. If events or people trigger these insecurities and reopen old wounds, we feel particularly vulnerable and weak. We want them to, so we feel frustrated. Or perhaps an old wound from childhood is suddenly reopened. If we anticipate that a partner could be ending the relationship, and we have a great fear of being, according to the psychoanalyst and writer Erich Fromm, if parents are too domineering, if they repress their children's need for power and independence, such children are often the types who later like to dominate and tyrannize others. If they were beaten as children, they often resort to beating and physical abuse as adults. In this way, they turn the enforced passivity in their childhood into something active as adults, giving them the feeling of control they sorely lacked in their pattern for them as adults, as they often repeat the same types of strategies that worked in childhood. If we observe the passive aggressor closely enough, we can often see the manipulative child peeking through the adult mask. And ailments, anxiety attacks, depression, headaches that make their suffering seem quite real. Since childhood, we have all been capable of willing such symptoms to get attention and sympathy. Sometimes a similar dynamic is played out between parents and their children. A mother, for instance, can shower her daughter with the person who is made to feel dependent is returned to the position of the needy and vulnerable child, wanting more. It is hard to imagine that someone who is or was so attentive could be using this as a ploy. See fit, doing whatever they want with impunity. They are exploiting the fact that many of us, since early childhood, are prone to feeling guilty at the slightest impetus. This strategy is used most obviously in certain individuals and get them to quit or submit. Such tyrants may try to act like helpless children. They are the temperamental artist or genius type, so naturally brilliant and absent-minded. Their pleas for our intelligence and cleverness. It was revealed to us in its purest state in childhood. This energy made us bold and adventurous, not only physically but mentally, wanting to explore ideas and soak up, explore together. It also made us rather relentless when it came to solving problems or getting what we wanted. Children can often be bold in what they ask for. It made us open to the world and to new and sustained. It has so much more force behind it. By following such a path, we can recover some of that pure spirit we had as children. Feeling bolder, more integrated, and more authentic. Admit to something slightly dirty, perhaps revealing too much self-absorption. But think back to your childhood and youth. You inevitably entertained big dreams and ambitions for yourself. Instead, what you must do is embrace that childish part of you. Revisit your earliest ambitions, adapt them to your current reality, and fearlessness. We are bold creatures by nature. As children, we were not afraid to ask for more or assert our will. We were remarkably. King could navigate the nation through this crisis. He had to regain the upper hand over these rowdy children. The news that his beloved wife, Gabrielle, had died in premature childbirth. He felt horribly guilty for not being by her side in that moment, and the thought that he had no chance to say goodbye to her. Alive at the time, we are doing so from a peculiar angle, that of being a child, physically smaller, more helpless, and dependent on adults. From this point of view, the world of the adults can seem rather alien. Often see as comical or odd. We may watch the same forms of entertainment as they do, but we see them from the angle of a child. Kind of collective mindset, as we absorb the prevailing culture at the same time as our peers, from the point of view of childhood and youth. And because we are too young to understand or analyze this, our own time, we can clearly see this. We start with the silent generation. As children experiencing the Great Depression and as adults coming of age during World War II and the post-war period, we are usually hypersensitive when it comes to our own generation. The perspective was formed in our childhood, when we were most vulnerable, and our emotional bond to our peers was. Generation X were children during the sexual revolution and adolescence in the era of latchkey kids. For millennials there was 9/11ths. Raised you permissive, over-controlling, neglectful, or empathetic? The famously permissive style of those who raised children in the 1890s helped create the wild, carefree attitude of the lost generation of the ended up being quite self-absorbed and somewhat neglectful toward their children, who could not help but feel a bit alienated and even angry because of this. Parents who are overprotective will shape a generation that fears going outside its comfort zones. These parenting styles come in waves. The children who were overprotected do not to 44, and those in midlife, 45 to 66. No matter how close the parents and children of these generations might seem, there is always an underlying tension, along with some resentment, to be gained by looking at the world from the perspective of your parents or your children, and even adopting some of their values. Feeling that your generation is superior is simply an illusion. Resurrect the spirit of childhood by bringing to life the spirit of your early years, its humor, its decisive historical events, the styles. Your work will resonate with your peers. You must use this strategy only if you feel a particularly powerful connection to your childhood. Otherwise your attempt to recreate the spirit will seem flat and bit of nostalgia. If you are inventing something, try to update and incorporate the styles of that childhood period in a subtle manner. Time, we can notice something peculiar. The passage of the hours or days can alter depending on our mood and circumstances. A child and an adult experience time very differently. For the former it moves, often fade with the years. For instance, we can regain some of the natural curiosity we had as children by dropping some of the smugness and know-it-all attitude that often come over us as we get his mind and body as he aged, and who by all accounts retained the most delightfully childlike and jovial disposition well into his 70s and 80s. The future, we can understand our effect on the future most clearly in our relationship to our children, or to those young people we influence in some way as teachers or mentors. This influence will last. The bullet in the side. As a child growing up in Savannah, Georgia, Mary Flannery O'Connor, 1925–1964, felt a strange and powerful connection to her father. Mary, an only child, did not feel the same way about her mother, Regina, who came from a socially superior class to her husband and future for his daughter as a writer. Mary knew from early on that she was different from other children, even a bit eccentric, and she basked in the pride he displayed in her unusual qualities. Academic year beginning in 1945. Her mother begged her to reconsider, thinking her only child was too fragile to live on her own. But Mary had made up her mind. Enrolled in the famous writers' right and right, insensitive to the pain, somehow realizing the potential that her father had seen in her as a child. Superficial, obsessed with material things and plagued by boredom. Like children, they had become unmoored, soulless, disconnected from the past and from religion, flailing around without any higher. We became aware of our mortality quite early on in childhood, and this filled us with an anxiety that we cannot remember but that was. Piaget, Jean, and Barbel and Helder,